All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Travis Culley. It's January 26th, 2026, and we're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. And Travis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course.
First question is, why wine?
I mean, just why not? I think one of the things I've always enjoyed from the time I became of age was to be able to try things and kind of where we came from, and Oregon and especially the northern Willamette Valley having such a incredible plethora of wine that we could try, and of course I didn't really understand that until I got a little older, working here in McMinnville, and I think that kind of led me to really, whenever I would travel or go other places, to try specific, whatever they're doing, wherever I can find. So it might be beer, it might be wine, it could be going through, bourbon country in Kentucky and trying that. So wherever I travel, I like to try that.
Let's talk about life before wine a little bit. Tell us about where you're born and raised and kind of your early life.
Yeah, of course. So my dad was Air Force, and so I was born on Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona. And from there, we moved to Ramstein Air Force Base in West Germany, and I was there from the age of 5 until 9, and my parents had actually been stationed in Germany before I was born, so they kind of knew all the places that they liked to go and see, and so that was probably my very first introduction to wine was, because my parents had been there before and knew everywhere to go. At least once a month we're at a beer fest or a wine fest or doing a Volksmarch, and so I always remember my parents having a glass of wine or a little taster in their hands when we were out at these festivals, and of course my introduction to wine was most likely German Riesling, and so it was much later that I found out there was a different color of wine, but yeah, no, I remember quite early doing that, and then we moved to Great Falls, Montana. We were stationed there for a couple years, and then finally my mom's family owns a Century Farm in Western Oregon growing wheat, and my cousin was the 4th generation of it until he sold it a few years ago. So my parents grew up in a town called Weston, halfway between Pendleton and Walla Walla. And so I graduated from Pendleton High School in 1990 and then came down to Linfield from there.
Why Linfield?
Mom graduated in 1960, so she was here. And one of the things that, she really loved was this school.
Tell me about your initial impressions of Linfield when you got here.
Wow, I mean, it was just interesting. I mean, it's the first time that your parents drop you off and you get to see it and do life on your own without having to ask permission to do things. And honestly, it was that very, very first week. There was a guy who lived across the hall from me. I was in Frericks, and so he asked me. That first week you just do orientation, you're just being led around and have to, go to different classes and meet your professors and sign up for classes. But he'd walked across the hall one day when we didn't have anything planned, and he said, "Are you looking for a job?" And I was like, "No, maybe, I guess." And he's like, "Well, I work at a restaurant, and I have to go down and do cleanup." And I'm like, "What do I have to do?" And it's like, clean toilets and take out the recycling and mop the floors and that kind of stuff. And I was like, "All right, sounds good." So it was like the days before I ever got to Linfield, or took classes, and we were down at Nick's Italian Cafe, mopping the floors and getting everything ready. And so that was kind of where it all began for me. But yeah, Linfield was a great experience.
What did you major in?
Chemistry.
And what did you anticipate doing with a chemistry major?
I don't really know. I had really no idea what. I mean, I know a lot of high school kids know exactly what I'll be when they grow up, and I kind of wish I knew what I was going to be when I grew up too. But I'm still kind of working on that. But I just happened to be good at science, and so I just kind of did it, and I didn't really have any grand plans for it. And as it turned out, it was actually during Jan term of '92, and there was a lab that actually had started in Murdoch Hall by a former professor, John Dolan. He graduated in like early '70s. His father, Wynn, was I think the only person who's been president here twice. But we took a tour of that lab, and it was over behind where the Green Apartments are, if you guys still call it the Green Apartments. And it was just a little horrible business complex. And so we had like a 2 or 3 room lab down there, that then expanded over, I forget what part of town that is, but so yeah, we took the tour, and during Jan term when I was taking analytical chemistry with Dr. Reinert, and I remember looking at this lab and thinking like, well, I could do this, and so I applied for a job there a couple of years later, put on my nicest T-shirt, and walked over there and asked if they were looking for work, and they said, we're looking for people with degrees, and I said, I'll have one of those in 3 months, I'll come back, and so. Spent 6 years doing that, and been kind of doing kind of chemistry and that kind of thing ever since.
So I want to get back to Nick's, but I want to talk about your time at Linfield a little bit. What were some of aside from that, what were some of the kind of standout memories, certain classes, friends, activities?
Yeah, I mean, the chemistry professors, Reinert, Diamond, Wolcott, Hamby. Yeah. But yeah, really good guys, and I guess it blew me away because Dr. Reinert was here from the time he would roll in his motorcycle leathers until he probably was getting kicked out of his office at 10 o'clock at night. He was very dedicated.
Were you engaged in any kind of intramurals or kind of on-campus activities? Yeah,
I did intramural tennis, intramural soccer. Did both of those. One of my friends, my senior year, went out to a secondhand store and bought a whole bunch of really horrible Hawaiian shirts, and so our intramural team was the Puppets of Satan, and so everybody had a different name. I believe I was John Wilkes Booth or Charles Manson, and so everybody had a different Puppet of Satan name. But yeah, it was just fun, and the IM field was right there. If it's the same place, I don't know, but it's in front of Failing, so we play there. My sophomore, junior year, a good friend of mine really enjoyed mountain biking, and so I did a lot of that. So me and some college friends would head up kind of the Rainbow Lodge area, and every other weekend and sometimes a couple days after class, we'd head up there and do a lot of mountain biking. And then we did a road trip down to Moab a couple years during spring break, and I did mountain biking down there on the Slick Rock trails. It was a lot of fun.
So let's talk about Nick's a little bit. You mentioned it just kind of a fluky spot to start working. Yeah. Tell me about your initial impressions, the first work, the first kind of thoughts you had about being there.
That's kind of crazy. I mean, we ended up out there on a Monday night. Nick's was closed Monday night, and that was just the day that we had to do just the really big closing job. And we take the grill apart and take all the recycling out, and so we were down there for hours cleaning up, and it wasn't like it was a lot of work. It was just tiring, but I still remember at one point, and probably won't admit to drinking at Nick's underage at that point, but I just remember at the end of the evening. Actually laying out on the prep counter there and like staring at the ceiling in the back crowd, and going, I think college is going to be fun. And the guy that worked there with me, he'd worked there for years, and his family worked there for years, Jonathan Faust, and he'd done some cooking and that kind of stuff. And I'll never forget, after like 2 or 3 hours of cleaning, he'd parked his Volkswagen there in front of the Mac Theater, and we're just getting ready to get in, and he left his lights on, and we turned the engine, and it was dead. And I remember like trying to push it down the street, and then somebody else stopped and pushed it down the street, and I just remember like kind of almost hanging on as we're trying to push the car down the street. This is my second night in McMinnville. I had no idea how far we were to campus, and we were just like walking back to campus that night. And so yeah, it was great. We'd go down there 2 or 3 days a week. Go to class, go down and clean the restaurant. Mop floors and all that kind of stuff, and then head back and take our afternoon classes. And so for the first couple of years, I was just mainly doing like cleanup type stuff, and then really expanded from there. I was there for 11 years.
Tell me about how it expanded.
Sure. I mean, there was a lot of high school kids and a lot of college kids that have, been through there over the years, and later I was hiring those guys later, and so I think they just get to know you over time, and at some point they're just like, hey, can you come in and wash dishes tonight? And so you pick up an afternoon shift here, an afternoon shift there, and then from there I think I started waiting tables right after I graduated, and so that was '94, and I'd still spend a little time in the kitchen. And so I was probably, I had a day job as a chemist and 40 hours a week, and then I'd go down to Nick's and wait tables 2 or 3 nights a week, and then I just kind of kept going from there. Nick's mother Georgia passed away in '95 or '96, and I used to just go down the weekends and read the newspaper, and so she'd be down there doing prep and that kind of thing. I remember after she passed away, I started helping out on the weekends and doing prep and making all the desserts and the creme brulee and the mousse, and I was still waiting tables, so I'd do my day job as a chemist, go in there on the weekends and do prep, then come back and then come back and wait tables that night, and then at one point a lot of the older waitresses who'd been there for years started moving on, and I ended up taking over like the hiring and the training of people for a couple years, and really wasn't that big of a deal, setting up schedules so that was kind of just the progression from taking out recycling to working there for 11 years.
What did you find interesting about working in the food service industry?
It was such an incredible, I take it for granted now. I've lived such a lucky life to have found a place like that. Any given day, David Lett would be walking in to come and say hi to Nick, or I'd be waiting on the Ponzi's, or any assortment of winemakers might be coming through at one point or another, and the tourists coming in, and Nick's had been there since 1977, and so it was really cool to be a part of something that was so. Nick's opened 3 years before David Lett's 75 South Block won the Olympics of the wines. The Oregon wine industry didn't exist back then. To what it was at that point. Obviously David Lett had been there for a decade, but to think that, Nick's was there before the Oregon wine industry kind of got exploded, and then it just became such a fixture of the Oregon wine industry, and so it was kind of really cool to be a part of that. It just felt like, this kind of club that you were in that tourists would want to come to see, and the winemakers would want to come down and hang out, and so it was great. The great part about it was, I have friends who still work in the industry, and they've gone through formal training, and Nick's wasn't like that at all. If you showed an interest in something, he would let you do it, and so it was cool.
So tell me about starting to meet the people in the industry. You mentioned the Letts, you mentioned the Ponzi's. Tell me about starting to meet the people and kind of starting to get to know the industry a little bit. What was it like in the days you were there?
It was great. David Lett was probably the one that was down at the restaurant most often, and so he would come in, or Diana would come in, and they would come in with their son, and he was a humongous chocolate dessert addict. So he'd always find his way into the wine room and just kind of like read books and stuff, and ask for whatever special desserts we had, and he was a lot of fun. And David was just such a nice guy, no nonsense, and so it was kind of cool. And I'll never forget. He was a guy who had been in the industry for so long, and he was just a guy that came into the restaurant. He was such a good customer. And there was another woman who I got to know at Willet Kinsey Winery years later, and Willet Kinsey was one of the other few places that would grow Pinot Meunier, and David, was one of the few that did that as well. And I still remember I was at the counter one time, and I think her name was Elizabeth, and she came up and said, is that David Lett? And here's a woman who actually worked in the industry. She worked at Willet Kinsey, and had never actually met him, and wanted me to make the introduction. I'm like, that's just David. Yeah, sure, I'll make the introduction. So it was just kind of cool, because these were just all people I knew. There was really no kind of there was really no barrier.
So I'm going to back up for a second and talk about your day job a little bit. You mentioned going into chemistry. Tell me about kind of the first job you had and how it progressed.
Sure. So I worked in a lab called LC Resources, stood for liquid chromatography, and John Dolan, who I mentioned earlier, is really one of the just most incredible people in the industry, and some of the other people, another guy named Lloyd Snyder. We had the offices in California, and so they really wrote some of the most incredible books, Introduction to Modern Liquid Chromatography, HPLC method development, and troubleshooting. I mean, these guys wrote books on this, and so it's very cool to learn that specific thing from them. Mm-hmm. And so I really just started out as a bench chemist. There were 6 of us in the lab, I think, and so I just kind of learned how to do method development and troubleshooting instruments. And the lab that I work in now, we have field service engineers who will come in and repair the equipment or set the equipment up for us, and that wasn't what it was like for us. We'd get the machine, the brand new machines in boxes, and we would put them together ourselves. And so to be able to learn all that from scratch was pretty incredible experience. Opened a lot of doors for me down the road. I was in a job interview 7 or 8 years ago, and John Dolan we'd co-authored some papers together. He was mainly he did a editorial column for a LCGC magazine, but at least one of the people was reading my resume, and they're just like, "You worked with John Dolan?" It was he was one of the most respected people in the industry for that. So and I remember at the end of the interview, he was one of the interviewees, and there was somebody else. I'm like, well, we'll check some of your references or something like that. And the guy over here said, but he worked for John Dolan. I'm like, so that was pretty cool to and again, just lucky to have had that chance to work with people that are so influential in that industry. Actually, I remember. This is actually a funny one. There was a guy who I introduced myself to when I was in another lab I was working at, and when he found out that I'd worked with John, had said, like, "Why are you not my boss?" And in his older lab that he'd worked in Colorado, John had written this book, this editorial called LCGC, and it was troubleshooting and different things. In their lab, they had actually made this sort of like John Dolan shrine. So when instruments had gone down or crashed or whatever it was, they would just little candles and silly pictures and stuff like that. But it was kind of crazy to have worked with that guy, and people across the industry knew who he was.
So tell me about how your career has progressed. What are some of the projects you've worked on that you're proud of, or some of the sort of some of the roles you've held in your career?
I've done a variety of things. After that, I went into teaching for a while and taught chemistry. That was fun. And then tried to branch out from that a little bit and worked in the semiconductor plant down in Eugene for a while, just to try something entirely new. But it wasn't as interesting to me as doing lab work. And so I moved up to Portland in 2006 and worked in a variety of labs at that point. So worked in an environmental lab for a little while, a food lab for a while, and then really kind of broke in to doing quality assurance at Widmer Brothers Brewing in 2009. And I think part of the thing that got me into wine, but also into alcoholic beverages in general, is I had an older cousin who was 11 years older than me. So when I was growing up in Pendleton, he'd invite me over to his house to help him brew beer. And it really wasn't like I was doing anything besides chatting with him and playing darts and listening to music while we're waiting for the the beer to boil and all that kind of stuff. And so I'd always and I got to Linfield and taught some of my friends there how to brew as well, and so that's how I ended up there. It was fun being in that, and that kind of got me into the manufacturing industry. And so I was doing less kind of lab work and more kind of like manufacturing. And every job just kind of opens doors down the road. And so from 3 years of working in Widmer Brothers, I worked into another manufacturing plant that was manufacturing cosmetics. And again, still doing quality assurance, but just one door opens another. And then moved on to a cannabis lab for a couple years, a little less than a year, just to because it was such a growing industry, I was kind of curious about it. And then I spent the last 3 years working for a company that manufactures gummy vitamins in Vancouver. So I'm one of the supervisors of the lab up there. My colleague and I have about 20 microbiologists and chemists below us that do all the product release testing and the raw ingredient testing for everything that goes into the gummy vitamins.
That is quite a varied career. I love it.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've just, like I said, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and one thing just kind of led to another, and so I just kind of rolled with it the whole time.
So tell me about quality assurance as a kind of a practice. What do you do? Say Widmer Brothers. What were you doing on a kind of a daily basis in quality assurance?
Irritating people. That's the thing that sucks about quality assurance. I mean, you're just there to make sure that the product is good. You're not one that's actually making anything or doing anything. You're there really to kind of I know that everybody comes to work every single day really wanting to do a good job and everything else, but at the end of the day, it's got to be a good quality product. And so I mainly, during Widmer, spent a lot of time supporting the line, and so the bottling line, and making sure that the labels were looking good, and making sure that the oxygen levels in the beer were good. So you're just doing a lot of testing, and if things didn't look good, you'd have to be that guy that would make that call to shut the line down and make sure that the labels weren't looking bad, or making sure the boxes weren't looking good. But again, you were just irritating people because they just wanted to do their job, and they just wanted to keep things going. But it was a fun place to work at. But it's the same thing where I'm at now, where I don't work in the factory making the gummies. We just do all the testing, and again get to irritate people by telling them that their stuff is out of spec and needs to be fixed or thrown away. So, yeah.
So backing up for a second to Nick's, tell me about starting to learn wine. Obviously, you had an introduction to wine. You had an interest in wine. Tell me about learning it to the point where you could sell it.
I guess for me, waiting tables, I've just always been a person who is curious about things, and I want to know more about things. And I really hate saying, I like saying I don't know if I don't know. But if it's my job to stand and wait tables and have somebody say, hey, can you recommend a wine? And just be like, it just felt stupid. And so that was really one of the great things about Nick's, is we got a brand new case of wine in. John, the business guy there that did all the books, or Nick, was like, hey, we just got a new case of wine and we're going to open a bottle. And Nick was always yeah, great. And the whole staff would try it so we could kind of learn about it, and so we could sell it better. And so as much as I could, I really got to know the wines that we had on the list, and the vineyards that they came from, and maybe the people who made them, how many months in the barrel they did, what kind of clones and that kind of stuff. And while I maybe couldn't tell you what Wadensville was doing versus 777 or something like that, customers appreciated that you knew more than just oh, it's a really nice wine, And so, it really, again, a progression. I remember some friends and I were coming back from Portland one day, and this was fall of '94, and at that point in the industry, we didn't have wine tasting rooms, we didn't have all that kind of stuff as much as we do now, and so Thanksgiving and Memorial Day were the only times that you get to try all these wines, and we were heading back from Portland and saw the signs on the side of the road, just sort of like sandwich board things for Adelsheim, and so we're like, oh, let's just stop and do some wine tasting. And so that was my first introduction to Thanksgiving wines. And so it's funny, you kind of never forget those first things, but I still remember David Adelsheim, and he had this they had the regular tasting, the doing all their stuff, and then he would always set up and do something a little different, kind of reserve ones. And I remember at the time he was doing this vertical tasting of Chardonnays, the 85 and the 87 and the 91 and whatever it was, and it was just so cool to see something like that, And I remember actually that night too, when we were there tasting, and we just happened to run into Dr. Walker, who was a former president of the college my first 2 years here. And so chatted with him for a little bit. He was always a really nice professor. President. He and Dr. Bull were both really great. And we ended up at Adelsheim, and then we came back into town and stopped at Eyrie. And so I kind of made it a point at that point for every Memorial Day and Thanksgiving, especially for the wines that we had on the list at Nick's, to go and I could try their things and I could talk to the people and kind of like, so I'm waiting tables and I could say, oh yeah, I was just at the winery last week and you know, they were doing this and this and they've got a really beautiful site and so, you know, they're really like using the French oak at 20% new wood and you know, to me, there were people that waited tables at Nick's who were really good at pushing, oh, this amazing reserve wine that's $60 or $70 or whatever it might be, you know. And I could do that too, but I was so much happier turning somebody on to like a 20 or 20, I mean, these are 1990s prices, mind you. But, you know, a $20, $25 a bottle of wine that I knew they would really appreciate. I know they would enjoy it. And so, yeah, it was to me more of like being able to turn people onto it and educate them about it.
What did you, as you were going and visiting places and tasting these wines, what did you find as kind of, what were the kind of the defining qualities of Oregon wine at that point in the Northern Valley, or of the people, of the wines?
I mean, it was interesting because, you know, of course we associate Oregon with Pinot Noir, and I think there were those. I remember at one point Pinot Blanc was becoming a thing. We did a winemakers dinner at Nick's one time. It was called, I think it was called Blancs Have More Fun or something like that. So all the winemakers came down and brought their Pinot Blanc wine down, and we did a tasting for that. And you began to see people. Are we oaking Chardonnays or are we not oaking Chardonnays? And then this was just before Archery Summit came in and Willet Kinsey came in, and you saw like the gravity filtration wineries. You know, there's no pumping. It's just, you know, from one level to the other level to the other level, and it kind of was, there became those things. And again, I think with Archery Summit and Willet Kinsey, for me, they were more. I mean, to this day, Irie is still in a former turkey processing plant, you know? And so I think that was just that transition where money started being poured into it, and there became that interest of that it wasn't just like, you know, some people down here, you know, growing wine in a field and making it up. I mean, money became a big thing. And so, yeah, it was just, I think to me right at that cusp was where you could begin to see wine tasting rooms begin to open, and yeah, it changed a little bit. I mean, just because the people that I've remember at that time at Nick's, you know, the first generation winemakers, it became a little bit different. But I guess the one thing that I really liked is when I was mentioning earlier about that person, you know, wanting to meet David Lett. It just always felt like, you know, camaraderie. People knew each other. You'd be out at a restaurant, and you'd see another person that was in the industry, and you'd say hi, and you'd chat with them, and so that was the really nice thing. It wasn't like there was these people coming in and building things and being competitive. They always seemed to have a respect for what was here before. Mm-hmm.
So of course, as Nick's as you were working at Nick's, of course, IPNC was kind of coming around and starting to grow. Tell me about the role you had with IPNC.
It's kind of funny. So in Pendleton, there's a small wine shop there called the Great Pacific Wine and Coffee Company, and I think in Pendleton, I can say this because I'm from there, but I think it's the only place that like Democrats were allowed to, you know, congregate in large groups. But I remember being there with a friend of mine right after I'd gone to college, and I'd gone down there to you know, get some food with a friend of mine. And I remember looking up at the wall, and it was the original like IPNC poster, and then right next to that was the Adelsheim Chardonnay with Diana Lett on it. And I remember just thinking, like, that's where I go to college, you know, McMinnville. And I guess I really hadn't. You know, I worked at Nick's and I went to college here, but I was only here for like the first during classes, you know, I was never here in the summer. And so I kind of like looked up and I was like, IPNC McMinnville, Oregon, that's where I go to college. And I had that, you know, that old, the kind of side view of the guy, you know, drinking the wine. And so my first summer that I was actually here on campus, I was working in '93 for Linfield Research Institute, and with Dr. Mackey, who was my advisor the whole way through. He was physics professor, but he was always such a nice guy that I just kept him the whole time. And he had actually one of the cooks at Nick's, Giroux, who had been a professor at Linfield back in like the 70s or something like that. He would always ask, how's Rose doing? But anyway, I was working at Linfield Research Institute, and so I wanted to be at I wanted to volunteer, but it was tough because I was doing things, and so. I'm pretty sure it was Joni Drabkin, but I remember I wanted to volunteer, and I made some phone calls, but I couldn't really dedicate. I wasn't sure when I could do it. And she's like, well, can you drive? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, can you go up to Portland and pick up one of our chefs? And I was like, okay, sure. So she gives me a phone number, and so I give this guy a call, and I'm like, hey, my name's Travis, and I'm volunteering at IPNC, and so they want me to come up and pick up your stuff. And he's like, okay, that's great, and he gave me directions, and I in high school driven big, huge wheat trucks on my uncle's farm, but these are, in fields. And so I go over there, and they gave me the key to this kind of like U-Haul sized van. And he had given me the directions, and I'd never really driven around Portland at that point that much, but it was in Atwaters at the Big Pink, but he gave me directions how to drive down to the parking garage and everything. So I get in there, and gave me how to get up to the escalator. And so I get up at the top, and this guy, I open the door, and he's like, hi, I'm Mark Gould. And so we loaded up his stuff, and he wasn't quite ready. And I still remember, I'd worked at a restaurant, but this place seemed fancy, and looking out over the city and all that kind of stuff, Atwaters. And but I still remember it thinking so hilarious, because here I am in this fancy restaurant. They weren't quite ready to go yet, and they just had boxes of Frosted Flakes and Lucky Charms and all that kind of stuff on the table. So we're sitting there having breakfast at Atwaters, looking out over the city, and then we loaded up his van and went down and drove him back to Nick's, and then at the end of the festival, loaded up all of his empty stuff and took it back. And he came down and guest chefed at Nick's after he left Atwaters years later, after I think maybe right at the time they opened Red Star for him in Portland. And every time my wife and I go to the Yamhill Carlton Festival every year now. Of course, he's doing a lot of work with Ken Wright and has been for years. Still remembers me from 1993. He's always been such a really, really nice guy. But yeah, that was really cool. And I remember I was actually in one of the malls in Portland at one point, a couple weeks before that, and there was a guy wearing an Oregon Brewers Festival t-shirt, and I was planning on going to that the next weekend, and I was like, oh, hey, I'm volunteering there. I'm going to the Brewers Festival next weekend, and he's, oh, I'm a volunteer there. I'm like, oh, I'm volunteering at IPNC this weekend. He knew what that was, and he wanted to actually volunteer at the IPNC and at the Brewers Festival. So we kind of talked about it. It was just, you start to see people with T-shirts for IPNC or Oregon Brewers Festival, and the different things that are going on in the industry for all the different alcohols and things that we do here.
What was your impression of IPNC?
Well, all I really did was take a U-Haul up to Portland and pick some of these stuff up, and I remember loading all the stuff into Dillon after we got down there, and then come back, and at that point Nick may have, because he was always doing the pasta for the Friday or Saturday, and so I probably just said hi to them as they were getting set up, and I still remember that was the first time I'd ever had a fig. Everybody has figs as fig Newtons, which are horrible, but I was talking to Mark about what he was going to be serving. He's like, I'm doing figs, and so let me have one. I remember really not liking it at that point, but they're one of my favorite fruits now. But so I really wasn't involved in it that much. But what I remember about IPNC the most, especially my that first year, I was staying in Campbell as a student because I was working on campus, and suddenly on Sunday night, any horizontal surface in Campbell had a half-empty bottle of wine in it, because I think all the students who had been volunteering at IPNC at the Salmon Bake or something like that. So it was just kind of bizarre. I was used to seeing this at Nick's wine all over the place, but all of a sudden Campbell, there's just wine here, there's empty bottles, and I had kind of no idea exactly where it all came from. But I still remember, you'd see there was the big char spot in the middle of the ground and out that kind of stuff. But my experience was just peripheral and picking people up, and then trying to figure out why there was just wine bottles spread all over Campbell Sunday night. But
Amazing.
But I think the next year, I also volunteered. But again, it was tough because I was working at that point. But I remember, again, I think I talked with Joni, and I think I just came down and helped cleaned out Dylan in the back of the kitchen and that kind of stuff, and just so people could have their spaces and everything ready. But those were kind of the 2 times that I volunteered at IPNC.
So we talked a bit before we started the interview today about the famous photo in front of Nick's of the Oregon wine community and how you managed to find yourself in that photo. So tell me a little bit about that and about your kind of decision to make sure you're in the photo.
So I don't really know what that was. I know it's on the IPNC website, but I don't necessarily know if that had anything to do with IPNC. But for some reason at Nick's, and I was waiting there from '94 to 2001, and I have a feeling that photo was taken sometime between '97 and '99. But it was an incredible night because everybody in that photo was in there. That was every first and second generation Oregon winemaker, and everybody knew each other. Everybody was sitting at a table, but then they move, and that was actually an annoying part of it because you were normally waiting tables, bringing food out at different courses, and people just wouldn't stop talking or getting up, and there was just wine all over. People just would bring in their wine. That night we did the dinner, but everybody brought their own wine in, and so you'd see these library wines from all over the place. And I still remember at one point, I'm pretty sure it was Myron, who I don't think he ate anything that whole night. His food was always there, but you'd always see him like walking around the kitchen. There'd be a spare bottle of wine here that he wanted to try, a spare bottle of wine there he wanted to try, and. But at one point, they decided they were all going to go out and take that photo. And I don't know what it was, but I knew that photo was going to be famous down the road. I was just like, there's absolutely no way that this will not be remembered because of all the people that are in that photo. And I just remember thinking to myself, you know what? I'm definitely not a winemaker like any of those people were, but I worked at Nick's, and so I just had to put a chair up there so I could we had those kind of curtains, and I just remember standing up there and standing there long enough to make sure that I was going to be in the photo. But I couldn't say that I knew it was going to have the staying power and being on websites into the 2020s. But I remember that fall celebrating Christmas with Nick and some other people at the restaurant, and he all gave us, there was the book, The Boys Up North, I think is what it was, and he gave everybody that came to his house that night a copy of that book, and then this page through it, and he gave us like a 3x5 or whatever, nice glossy picture of that as well. And so I have that picture somewhere in my house in a book in a box somewhere. But yeah, you couldn't look at that crowd of people and not realize it. Yeah.
So after leaving Nick's, how did you stay with the industry? What other roles did you kind of have around wine, around food?
Well, there was a woman who worked with me at Nick's for a while, and she worked at there was a wine shop that was next door to Nick's, and then she did different things in the industry, so I got to be friends with her. And there was one day that she just asked me if I wanted to go to wine tasting with her, and she must be she was a wine buyer for somebody, and it was actually ended up being a Riesling tasting in Portland. But she's like, on the way up, we're going to stop at a winery and have lunch, and so I ended up at Willie Kinsey that day. Just they weren't open. It was just the workers there hanging out and opening some wine and cooking a meal, and I remember they had this. They were making kind of a vinegar called verjus, I think, and my mom used to make a wilted leaf lettuce salad when I was a kid, and so I ended up I'd worked at Nick's for years, and so I was like, I can make up a wilted leaf lettuce salad if you guys give me some bacon and some lettuce, and so it was just really kind of cool to hang out there. And then she and I went up to Portland and did the wine tasting at this. It was a Liner L Center, one of those type of stores in Portland, and. So as I got to talking with her, and she knew that I was interested in that kind of thing, and kind of wanting to expand a little bit outside of Nick's, not really to leave the restaurant, but to just continue to grow. And so she introduced me to, she knew that, again, Memorial Day and Thanksgiving, they need people, and we didn't have the kind of critical mass of people that could talk the talk at that point. And so she introduced me to Danielle Andrus, who was at Archery Summit. And so in the Memorial Day of '97, I ended up working up there and pouring wine, and again, like, I'd pour wine all day, get off, run down, go to Nick's and work that night. And I mean, Memorial Day weekend was a nightmare because it was not only Memorial Day weekend in the wine industry, but it was also Linfield graduation. And so that was, probably 16-hour days for all weekend, but it was so much fun. And I'll never forget, they gave me a station and they gave me some wine to pour and they gave me some stuff to talk about. And, people would come by and it was so much fun to talk, to the different people. And I remember some point this couple came through and they was like, how long have you worked here? And I'm like, I don't know, 2 hours? I mean, and they were like, really, I mean, it felt cool because they were very impressed with the knowledge that I had and the enthusiasm for it. And I still think, and I forget his name, I think his name is Pascal. He was a famous chef in Portland for a while, but I think she had him like doing like the catering for it. And it was just crazy because I'm like, everybody would like kind of rotate in and have lunch. I just remember having like this baked brie and fila dough, and I was like, okay, I could do this. And so I worked Memorial Day and Thanksgiving. I kind of alternated between Willa Kinsey and Archery Summit for a few years. A woman that I was talking about earlier, Elizabeth, I got to know her at the restaurant and told her I'd done Archery Summit. And she said, hey, would you come up and work at for us at Willa Kinsey during Thanksgiving? And that's when Laurent was a winemaker up there, and Jimmy Brooks was the assistant, so it was really cool to get to know Jimmy before he passed away. And so I think 97, 98, 99, I would do Memorial Day and or Thanksgiving at those places and work the whole weekend and then, go work at Nick's as well. And but it was that chance to kind of be on that side of the table and pouring wines for the people and, getting to know the winemakers and and I could always bring that back to the restaurant too and talk about those experiences. And then, one day as I was working at Nick's, this couple came in and I got to talking with them and they were like, oh yeah, we started a winery a few years ago and introduced themselves to me and the name didn't really, click with me. I didn't know who they were. And then my college roommate and I, were doing a Memorial Day or wine tasting at some point. I don't remember when it was. And but we would go to like that very first early tasting. Back Beau Frere used to do like a 9 a.m. tasting or something stupid like that. I was like, hey, we'll get there before the crowds go. And I mean, I had to go to work at Nick's probably at 5 o'clock that night anyway, so we had to, knock them all out. But I remember showing up at this winery called Belpont, and we were there like half an hour before it opened. And so we had a football in the back of the car, and so we were just sitting in there in the parking lot playing catch. And I remember the winemaker coming out, Brian, and I think he was just trying to figure out why these two guys were playing football in his driveway. And so I introduced himself. I was like, oh yeah, I waited on you at Nick's, a little back, and he remembered that. And then we did the tasting at Belpont, but then about 6 months later. He must have called Nick's looking for me, and they needed people to pour at the winery I think it was Memorial Day of 2000. And so Nick gave him my number at the lab that I was working at. And I did a call out of the blue from him. He said, hey, I'm Brian O'Donnell of Belpont. Would you like to come up and pour wine for me? And I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, and again, I wasn't looking for the job. I mean, but I think he saw my waiting tables at Nick's and getting to know things, and I'd probably talk to him about working at Willa Kinsey or whatever, and he just, calls me out of the blue, really kind of flattering to me, and so I've been, pouring at Belpont Winery Memorial Day and Thanksgiving since then. There's a few years, COVID, or they had some extra interns that are coming from New Zealand or France or whoever it might be, so I might not do, but I've probably done at least a Memorial Day or Thanksgiving almost every year for, I guess I was at Memorial Day. I wasn't there last Thanksgiving. I was at Memorial Day for so I'm guessing 27 straight years. So, and it's just, to me, it's just so much fun, Their daughter Riona was a toddler, and now she's in graduate school and medical school, and I've got to see all their winemakers throughout the years and the expansion of the winery. I had done a crush one afternoon for Ken Wright one time when he was pulling in. He was still working kind of for Domaine Serene and Ken Wright at the time, so we were pulling in fruit for one of them at one point, but I ended up doing a crush one weekend for Brian. It was fun just to be able to have that experience too, and to bring that to as I'm standing there and pouring. And again, it always kind of cracks me up because, I've been there for 26, 27 years, and people come in and they see the knowledge that I have, and I can talk about the grapes we have, and like, what do you do? And I'm like, just this. I'm just here, Memorial Day and Thanksgiving, and but it's enjoyable, and it's a lot of fun, and you get to meet people from all over the place. Yeah.
It's a pretty unique position to be able to see one brand that way a couple times a year for a quarter of a century. Let's talk about Belle Pond first to start. How has it grown and changed? What is the same? What is different?
Gosh. I think for me, when I first got there, Brian was doing very little of his own estate stuff. I think when I started pouring for him in 2000, I think he maybe had one case of his, or one barrel of his estate fruit, and that was it. And he was buying his fruit from a number of different places. And he was really the one that he always had a map on the wall that he could show people. And so he would really educate the customers and me as well about the differences between YC and Dundee Hills. Yeah, and the Jory soil and Wilkinson soil. So it was a really good education, and it was so much smaller. And I remember they just had that first winery, and gosh, Thanksgiving, his wife Jill would be out like freezing to death selling tickets outside until we were able to expand the winery and bring everything inside. And it's been cool to see how he has developed his own estate fruit, and he's doing more things with that. He's had some really cool bottlings of like just straight Dundee Hill stuff or straight YC stuff. The Belle Pond, he now has a separate thing, a really cool story, called the Rionas block, and the hillside Belle Pond means beautiful slope, and it's this big, long, meandering kind of hill. And I guess when they were putting the grapes in and digging the holes, all of a sudden this white chalky stuff started coming out at one point, and they really weren't sure what it was. And people started talking to other people, and so what they assumed was in one of the volcanic eruptions 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, whatever, there was just like a V in a hill where a whole bunch of like volcanic powder got stuck in that just stayed there, and so that's what that white stuff is. And so he's now got this, it's not just the Belle Pond, but then you have the Belle Pond Vineyard, and you have the Rionas block within that, and just the different things that I've got to see him do. I mean, he was initially doing a reserve Chardonnay every year, and that was mainly in wood, and then a regular one that was straight stainless steel. And now he's developed his style to more that's got a little bit of the wood and then a little bit of stainless steel blended together. His Chardonnays are always incredible. I don't remember if he had the Dijon clone or was selling. Was really growing much of it at the beginning. So to see how that's developed, it's, there's just more wines too, and the library stuff too. And I guess the other thing too about Brian that I've always liked is it kind of just brings me back. He's one of those humongous fans of German Riesling. And I remember when I started working at Nick's, back in, waiting tables in '94, Riesling was not an exciting grape for anybody. It was just kind of like that syrupy sweet thing, and there was a few winemakers that would do it, and I won't mention the names because nobody liked them. Not the winemakers, but just the wine. It just was people that came in that really didn't know what they wanted that sweet white Oregon Riesling. And I guess we didn't have white Zen, so we had white Riesling. And then, of course, like I remember, Jimmy Brooks really got into it when he started his place and started doing that. And I've had dinner at Brian's house a number of times, and you go down into a cellar, and it's like half Belle Pond stuff and then half German Riesling. It's so cool. And so I've always felt like there are some winemakers that, they sell white wine to be able to sell red wine, or they want to have the mix just to bring customers in. And the fact that he always takes his whites as seriously as the reds, which I always enjoyed, and his real experimentation now with skin contact gris and the Ramato stuff that he's doing. He's continuing to try new things, which I think is really cool.
So the other part of that is obviously you've seen now like a quarter century of customers coming through. I'm curious about how they have changed. What are they looking for? Different things? Are they asking different questions? How do customers approach the wine tasting experience now?
Man, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think back in the day, it wasn't as big, and so maybe I don't think people knew about the organic wine industry, and so the only people that were out doing it were people that were really into wine, And now, I think you'll see more people coming from out of state, or you'll see people coming from different countries to come and try it, and so you get more. You get more of that where people know Oregon wine, but at the same time, I think because of the size that it's become, you also have people who are coming because it's what to do on a bachelorette party or something like that, or people that just want to go hang out with their friends that weekend and they just want to go wine tasting and they have absolutely no clue about it, and that's not good or bad. It's just something else. So it's changed to where you have less people maybe that are as just hardcore nerdy about really wanting to know everything. I mean, you still have those guys. My sister probably thinks I'm one of them, but yeah, I mean, you just see I would say a broader aspect of people in general, because back in the day it was a smaller industry, Like I said, we just happened to see the Adelsheim sign on the side of the road was a sandwich board and Thanksgiving, and we not driven by that day, and I'd been spending 4 years in Nix at that point. I knew there was a wine industry. Back then it was a sandwich board, and nowadays there's probably websites.
One or two at least. So let's talk a little bit about that then. Obviously, you've seen a lot of growth in the industry. You've seen a lot of the industry's growth. Tell me about what is different now as you look at Oregon wine in 2026.
Prices. It's crazy. The prices have kind of blown me away a little bit, and but I think you also see quality with that too. You see entry level wines that they're good, but and I'm sure that if you've never experienced really, really good wine before, they're going to be absolutely perfect for you. And that's what I always tell people, that when my employees will come and ask me for a wine recommendation, I just always tell them, if you could just find a $20 bottle of wine that you enjoy, just don't stop drinking that. Because once you start getting into single vineyard wines and some of these reserve stuff, and you can't go back. But I think I do really like the emergence of the AVAs. I think that's really cool. One of my wife and I's first dates in 2010 was the YC AVA tasting, and they had it at the Armory in Portland in the Pearl District, Northwest, and which was cool. I mean, it was, she and I went to college together, and so but we kind of started dating later in life, but it was just, I think it was like our second date, and to just kind of like. Yeah. Sorry, it was cool to show up and just see all the people I'd seen before. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So obviously you're not engaged in the wine industry necessarily on a day-to-day level, but how have you seen the last few years sort of affect people's attitudes towards buying wine, and what do you hear from the industry in terms of where Oregon wine is right now?
Gosh, well, if you can keep from reading Jay McDonald's EIEIO newsletter, you'd probably feel better about yourself. But I really like Jay. I've known Jay for years, and he's always vocal about the amount of wine that's not getting sold, and it's a little troubling. I don't know really why that is. To me, I see an industry that's I don't think I can really understand it. I mean, and maybe I'm just looking at it as a microcosm of Oregon, but you have these areas like Burgundy or the Mosel or the Rhine or Napa that predated the Oregon wine industry. And so, is it everywhere? And maybe it is. Is it the fact that people are just broadening their palates and drinking different things? There was that rumor of the emergence of White Claw and horrible things like that years ago that are people are gravitating towards, and I think people want to blame it on Gen Z or those sort of things, which it's kind of ridiculous. I think people just do their own things and try their own things. So I don't know why it is that and again, I'm not in sales, I'm not in the winemaking, but you do see the last few times I've gone wine tasting, you're not seeing people pulling out their 23s, you're seeing people still pouring like 21s or 19s, which you didn't really see before. And I think it's cool because it's always nice to try library stuff, but at the back of my mind, I'm like, why do they still have 5-year-old, 6-year-old wine in their cellars? And that bothers me a little bit because I want them to do well.
So as you look ahead, what do you see? Do you see any further engagement for you in the wine industry, or is Belle Pont a couple times a year sort of the limit for what you want to do?
It would be great to do more. I would welcome something like that, whether it would be working in a wine shop or something like that. I hope that my retirement is closer than further away, and for me, it's always been the enjoyment of educating people. My wife and I have traveled to Burgundy, and we traveled to Chablis, and we have gone down to Santa Barbara and Sonoma. And so I always like to, when I'm pouring wine, talking to people about the different places that I've been to and the different wine regions and that kind of stuff. And so if I could have a place where I could continue to do that, even volunteer, those sort of things. It's hard with a 40-hour week job to do those things, and I'm an hour away from the wine industry as well. And so but yeah, it would be a lot of fun to do those sort of things. And I've actually come down, and I think Brian was doing a guest dinner on a Thursday night at Belle Pont years ago, pre-IPNC, and so he just had me come down and wait tables and that kind of thing in his house. And so, yeah, would I like to do more? Yeah. Is there time in the day and in life for that? I guess that's the other question too.
Anything else as you look ahead for your future? Anything else on your horizon that you're excited about, travel or personal or otherwise?
Well, my wife and I both love to travel. That was, it's funny as a kid with my parents living in Germany, and so we were always traveling, and so what I learned from that was I absolutely hate traveling, and it was actually going to Costa Rica in my junior year when I realized that I didn't hate traveling. I hated traveling with my family, and they're really nice people, but not fun to travel with. But I'm probably the same way. You have that program you want to be on, of like, up at 7 a.m. and doing all those things, and my parents are very great about planning all those things. And so I'm that way too, but just for the things that I want to see. And Costa Rica was the first time that I really got to do that. And so, granted, Costa Rica was like mountains or beaches, mountains or beaches, or rainforests or beaches. But yeah, my friends would, we'd head out to the beach one weekend, or we'd head to a rainforest the next weekend, and then Jan term of '94, ended up going with Dr. Fincher to Vietnam, Cambodia, southeastern China, and then his wife was a travel agent who set up all that travel, and so he invited me back to do a trip through Xi'an, Kunming, Burma, and Bangkok in '96, and I've always loved traveling since then. And but kind of like, I hate to say the word theme, but I remember years ago watching the Food Network, and that was like, Nick's got me into that, like cooking and food and that kind of stuff. And I remember watching this Food Network thing about barbecue, and I ended up taking like a barbecue tour. I flew into Texas and ate barbecue in Texas, and then drove up to Memphis and drove to St. Louis and that kind of thing. And one of my wife and I's first trips, was the Rust Belt tour. And so my dad was Air Force, so I always wanted to go to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. And so I wanted to hit Pittsburgh and Detroit and Cleveland and all the Rust Belt cities. And she wasn't as excited about it for some reason. But then I was like, what if we went through bourbon country? And then for some reason she was on board. And so we spent like 2 or 3 days hitting all the distilleries. And so so that's how we do all of our travels. We did Ireland last year and up to Belfast. And I'm a huge history buff. I really enjoy history. And but again, you're there, so you should be eating the food that they have. We're going to the Irish distilleries. We're buying socks at Irish breweries. We did Portugal a couple years before that, and even going through the Douro, and such a cool experience to like finally tawny, vintage and all that kind of stuff, but gosh, the history behind the British going in there. And so it was really cool to see the Douro Valley and then to kind of go down to also into Porto and taste the wines there. But everywhere we go, the food that they have there, we eat the food and we drink the whatever it is that they make. And so this year might be, we've been toying with Poland or Berlin as a vacation this year. We like road trips. Berlin might just be like a big city tour, but Poland might be history. But I like to just go someplace I haven't been to and learn about. We did Italy a few years ago before that, and as a family we did Rome. So it was my first time back since probably 79 or 80. And we just went south into kind of Puglia, Naples, and I mean, honestly, like the worst pizza you'll have in Naples is better than the best pizza you'll have in. I don't know how they do it, but it's incredible. So yeah, travel, eat, drink. That's kind of what I hope to do until I die.
So you've shared some great stories today from kind of your time in the industry. Are there any stories that you haven't shared that need to be part of the story today?
It's funny. I kind of touched on a little bit at we've gone in the wine direction, but I mentioned a little bit about my cousin who I brewed beer with, and so I got to Linfield, and I would still there was a better place like Burlingame Grocery, F.H. Steinbart's in Portland. You could buy brewing supplies. There wasn't a lot of that out in Pendleton, so I would pick stuff up and we'd go back and brew when I got into college. And but a couple of my friends in college were living in Newby, and they were 20 and I was 19 at that point. Their RA came down at one point, and they would have beers and then hide them in the back when the RA would come in, and they were. I remember the RA giving a speech about how you can't have beer. I mean, if you can make beer, you can have it, but you can't have it. And she left, and I remember just saying to my friends like, well, I can make beer. And so we ended up going down and buying all the brewing supplies that we needed to. And the very first batch we ended up making down on a Monday night at Nick's Cafe. So we're just down there on a Monday, brewing beer, taking it back into Newby. I mean, for a couple of years, the nickname was actually Brewby Hall. And we'd go down, or we actually would brew the beer sometimes, there in, but we just had a horrible electric stove in my friend's apartment. And and then I went to Costa Rica, and I came back, and they had just gone, full grain. Well, before that, we were making extract beers, and then I came back, and they were going, crazy full grain beers, then one of my friends, Alan, was a German major, and ended up going to Indiana University, but I went to visit him in Berlin back in '98. And at that point, he had finished his master's and decided he wanted to go on with his PhD. But he ended up taking me to class one day with him during his brewing school class, and it was just hilarious because he's introducing me to all his friends. This is the guy that got me into brewing. And of course, at this point, these guys are all part way through their education in brewing, and I'm just like, but it was cool because I was the Godfather or something like that. But And then when Alan came back, he worked in a few breweries, in Oregon, but he was the one that kind of got me in at Widmer. There was a really incredible guy, named Mike Dominigini, who was he'd been at Blitz Weinhard for a number of years, and the first place that I actually had my very first illegal beer. We ended up me and Alan and Paul ended up heading up to Blitz Weinhard and doing the tour, but not really thinking about that you had to be over 21. And then we get up there and we did the tour, and then you get down to the tasting room at the end and what do you want? We're and then so we probably lied, but yeah. So Alan ended up becoming a professional brewer, and he got me in at Widmer, and it was really cool because I had gone to what was called the Great American Beer Festival in Denver. He was going to go down and pour back in, I think, 2008 or so. And so we had a hotel, and he's like, "Oh, you should come down and do it." And I ended up that night getting into kind of the pre-thing, which just all the brewers would show up at I think it was Wine Coop Brewing, and then there was a really cool brew house there, and every brewer a name tag, and I just remember thinking these guys, it was like me for wine, but them for beer. And I just thinking about how cool it would be to be on that side of the table, doing the beer thing, and I still remember fighting my way to the taps at one point, and there's Don Younger, who owns the Horse Brass in Portland. There's 2 seats in this place in Denver, and he's found a way to get his own seat there at this tap room. And then I would, for some reason, was wearing a Yamhill Valley Vineyards T-shirt. They were really cool. Stephen Carey, and I forget his assistant, every couple of years they would bring us out, everybody from Nick's, to do they do a lunch for us and take us through the wines and everything. It was really nice of them. But I ended up getting one of their wine shirts, and there were these 2 guys there, and they were chatting with me, and wanted to know if I had gone to, if I worked there, and I didn't work at Yamhill Valley, but started talking about Nick's. And this guy started talking, his name ended up being Art Laurence, who graduated from Linfield '66, got the last catch for the championship team, but founded Portland Brewing and then Cascade Barrel House. And the other guy, and I forget what his name is, but he was doing all the sour beer program for those guys. And of course, my mom's college roommate Sharon Shepard was the first woman who was inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame here, and they knew of her through all the stories. They graduated earlier, but pretty famous in Linfield circles. And so anyway, I ended up working there, getting the job at Widmer, and then at that point, I knew Art Laurence, and of course, I didn't really know the Ponzi's all that much outside of waiting tables, at Nick's on them, but to know the guys at Bridgeport, and then being in the industry at Widmer, and just getting to know all the brewers of Hopworks and Breakside, and again, the Widmer brothers. I still remember when I got my job there, there were fewer people that wanted to know that whether I could get them a free beer, whether I could introduce them to the Widmer brothers. They were just kind of so famous, and so it was again such a lucky life to have got to know all those people in the wine industry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then do the beer industry as well, and still keep doing it, Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was just kind of all luck.
Love that. All the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that you're hoping to cover today?
No, I think we got it all.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to share all these stories with us, to share your story with us. Welcome back to campus over here on the south side. And we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.